In Florence, the Platonic Academy is reformed and this institute of learning comes about. Now we know that Leonardo da Vinci is not allowed to enter this academy. Is this a John or Maria Magdalene is a very easy question, but is a stupid question because it must be John. And it allows us to have an image of Christ. Legends about a miraculous image of touched the face of Christ and then bore a miraculous image. For over 500 years, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper has been hiding something, not a brushstroke, not an underdrawing. Actual words, full sentences written in Leonardo's own handwriting, buried beneath layers of paint so deep that no human eye could ever detect them. When researchers finally pointed an advanced AI at high resolution scans of the painting, what it decoded beneath the surface wasn't just a hidden detail or a lost sketch. It was a message, a deliberate, carefully structured message woven into the very architecture of the composition, spiraling outward from the figure of Jesus passing across each disciple, carrying a meaning so radical that if Leonardo had spoken it aloud in 1497, it likely would have cost him his life. The hidden meaning inside the Last Supper doesn't just add a footnote to art history, it changes what the painting actually is. And once you understand what those words say, you will never look at this masterpiece the same way again. The man who hid everything. Leonardo da Vinci didn't trust the world with his ideas. That's not speculation. It's documented fact. Thousands of pages from his personal notebooks survive to this day, and nearly all of them are written in mirror, script backward handwriting that can only be read when held up to a reflection. Scholars have debated for centuries whether this was a left-hander's convenience or a deliberate act of concealment. But here's the catch. His notebooks weren't just reversed. They were filled with coded abbreviations invented, shorthand and drawings layered with hidden geometry that researchers are still deciphering 500 years later. This was a man who buried ideas the way other people locked doors, and he had good reason to. Leonardo lived in an era when the Catholic Church held near absolute authority over knowledge, belief in public expression, independent thinking, especially thinking that question, scripture or divine authority, wasn't just controversial, it was dangerous. Galileo would later be placed under house arrest for suggesting the earth revolved around the sun. Giordano Bruno would be burned alive for similar ideas. Leonardo, who was already under suspicion for his unconventional lifestyle and relentless scientific inquiry, knew the cost of saying the wrong thing out loud. So he said it in secret in code and paint. When he began work on the Last Supper in 1495, he made a decision that baffled his contemporaries. Instead of using the standard buon fresco technique, applying pigment to wet plaster which bonds permanently, he experimented with his own mixture of oil and tempera on dry plaster. The result was richer color and finer detail, but the paint began deteriorating almost immediately. Within decades, the mural was already flaking. Most art historians have treated this as a failed experiment, but what most people don't realize is that Leonardo's technique created something a traditional fresco never could. Layers, multiple physical layers of paint, one on top of another, where markings on a lower surface could be completely invisible from above. Whether this was intentional or not has been debated for generations, but in light of what AI would eventually find beneath those layers, the question takes on an entirely different weight. For over 5 centuries, the Last Supper sat on that refractory wall in Milan, admired, restored, photographed, analyzed, and no one found what was underneath. Not the monks who ate beneath it, not the restorers who spent decades cleaning it, not the scholars who wrote thousands of pages about it. It took a machine to finally see what Leonardo had hidden, and what it found started with static and ended with a sentence that shook the foundations of art history. Noise or something else. Now, to be clear about what's real and what's speculative here, because that matters. What is documented fact? The Last Supper has been the subject of serious scientific imaging since the late 20th century. During the landmark restoration led by Pininfarina, Barcelona between 1978 and 1999, a painstaking 21-year effort advanced imaging techniques including infrared, reflectography and X-ray analysis were used to examine layers beneath the visible surface. These scans revealed Leonardo's original underdrawings, changes he made during composition, and details that had been obscured by centuries of dirt moisture and botched earlier restorations. More recently, high-resolution digitization projects, including a 2007 collaboration by HAL 9000 and the Italian Ministry of Culture that captured the mural at 16 billion pixels, have made it possible to study the painting at a level of detail Leonardo himself never could have seen. What has not yet happened, but is now technologically plausible, is the scenario this story explores. What if a modern AI trained specifically on Leonardo's handwriting and coded notation systems were turned loose on those high-resolution scans? What if the neural network found patterns beneath the paint that human eyes had overlooked for 5 centuries? Not brush strokes, not underdrawings, but actual words. That's the premise behind a project we'll call Da Vinci Decoded. Speculative but scientifically grounded scenario based on real imaging capabilities and real AI pattern recognition technology. In this scenario, the team began feeding hyperspectral scan data into a neural network trained on Leonardo's mirror. Script his notebook shorthand and his known symbolic vocabulary. For the first 2 weeks, the system produced nothing remarkable. Imaging artifacts, plaster degradation patterns, noise, and then on day 19, the system flagged an anomaly, a cluster of faint markings in a section of wall behind Jesus, the same dark area Dr. Rossi had been staring at for weeks in the Florence lab. Not brush strokes, not plaster cracks, something else entirely. The AI tagged the markings with a 67% probability of being intentional script rather than random deterioration. That number flashed red on the screen. Rossi stared at it. Then she called Fetty 67%. Not conclusive, not even close, but enough to start an argument. Marco Ferretti, the team's senior imaging specialist, looked at the flagged area and shook his head. That's fluorescence, he said flatly. Mineral deposits leaching through the plaster. He'd seen it 100 times in degraded frescoes across Italy. It meant nothing. Rossi disagreed. She pulled up a comparison, the flagged markings, alongside a sample of Leonardo's mirror. Script from the Codex Arundel. The curve patterns were uncomfortably similar. The spacing between marks was too regular. A fluorescence doesn't form consistent letter spacing, she said, and it doesn't repeat at predictable intervals across separate sections of a wall. Fetty crossed his arms. And 500-year-old paint doesn't preserve hidden messages. We're seeing what we want to see. This is confirmation bias dressed up as data. The exchange got heated. Voices rose. A junior researcher quietly left the room. The team was split down the middle. Half believed they were chasing ghosts and degraded plaster projecting meaning onto meaningless cracks. Half thought they might be standing at the edge of the most significant art discovery in a century. They agreed on one thing. They needed more data before anyone said another word publicly. Over the following weeks, the AI processed additional sections. The shadowed areas beneath the table, the stone archways, the folds of the disciples' robes. And the crazy part is the same types of markings kept appearing. Not everywhere, not randomly, but in specific recurring locations, always in the darker, less examined regions of the composition. Areas where a hidden layer of writing would be least likely to be disturbed by restorers or visible to the naked eye. The AI's confidence scores began climbing. 71%, 7883 individual letter forms started resolving. Reversed characters consistent with Leonardo's mirror script. The system matched them against his known handwriting with increasing certainty. Isolated words emerged from the noise. Umbra, shadow verita, truth, trodimento, betrayal. Fetty stopped arguing. He didn't say he was convinced. He just went quiet. And that silence from the loudest skeptic in the room told Rossi everything she needed to know. They weren't looking at mineral deposits. They were looking at Leonardo's handwriting hidden beneath the most famous painting on Earth. The words no one was supposed to find. Here's where the story shifts from discovery to something that feels more like detonation. The AI didn't just find scattered words. As more sections were processed, the fragments began connecting. Short phrases formed, then longer ones. And get this, they weren't placed randomly. The system detected a structural pattern, a spiral originating near Jesus' right hand and expanding outward, passing across each disciple in sequence. The placement followed proportions consistent with the golden ratio, a mathematical principle Leonardo used obsessively in his compositions. The words weren't just hidden in the painting, they were architecturally woven into it. The first fully coherent phrase appeared along the wall, directly behind Jesus. When translated from Leonardo's archaic Florentine dialect, it read, "All faith fades when light reveals the hand of man." Rossi read it aloud in the lab. No one reacted immediately. It took a few seconds for the implication to land. The line suggested that what people revered as divine might in fact be a human construction, that faith itself could dissolve under scrutiny in the context of a painting, depicting the foundational moment of Christian sacrifice. The message was a quiet bomb, but it was still just one line. It could have been a stray thought, a fragment from a notebook entry that bled into the composition, not yet a pattern. Then the second phrase surfaced near the shadow of Judas Iscariot. "He who eats with truth will not betray himself." A third appeared beneath Peter. "Strength without understanding is blind," near Thomas the Apostle, who famously doubted the resurrection. To question is not sin, but the path to clarity. Each message was tied to a specific disciple. Each one reframed that figure's biblical identity through a lens of reason and skepticism rather than faith. It's not that simple, though. These weren't attacks on religion. They read more like challenges, invitations to think rather than simply believe. Leonardo seemed to be embedding a philosophical framework into the painting itself, one that valued inquiry over obedience. And what most people don't realize is that this idea that human reason should stand alongside or even above institutional authority wouldn't become mainstream European thought for another 250 years during the Enlightenment. Leonardo wasn't just ahead of his time, he was operating in a completely different century. Rossi's hands were shaking not from fear, but from something closer to adrenaline mixed with disbelief. 22 years she had studied this man's work. 22 years of papers, conference lectures, and grant applications arguing that Leonardo's art contained layers of meaning that existing scholarship had barely scratched. Colleagues had called her theories romantic. Reviewers had called them speculative. One particularly dismissive peer review from 2016 had described her hypothesis as imaginative but unsupported by material evidence. She had kept that rejection letter pinned above her desk for 8 years. And now right in front of her, on a glowing monitor at 2:30 in the morning, the evidence was materializing letter by letter. She wasn't just witnessing a discovery. She was watching her entire career either be vindicated or destroyed, depending on whether the findings held up under scrutiny. Then the AI uncovered something that changed the room's atmosphere entirely. In the lower right section of the mural, buried beneath multiple layers of paint near the disciples' feet, the system assembled a longer passage. "Those who hold power will bury truth beneath stone until the eyes of the future uncover it." That wasn't philosophy anymore. That was a direct accusation aimed at institutions that suppress knowledge. And it sounded like it was addressed not to Leonardo's contemporaries, but to whoever would eventually be able to read it to us. Ferretti, who had barely spoken in days, broke the silence. He knew, he said quietly. He knew someone would eventually find this. He was writing to the future. The deepest layer came last, beneath the original pigment of Jesus' robe, so faint that only maximum resolution hyperspectral imaging could detect it. The AI resolved a final inscription. "Truth belongs not to saints, but to those who seek it in silence." And then when the AI assembled every recovered phrase in sequence, following the spiral pattern from center to edge, a unified statement emerged. Faith without reason is the sleep of truth, and those who wake shall see what was forbidden. Rossi didn't fall silent. She didn't stare at the screen. She put her head in her hands and laughed. A short, breathless, slightly unhinged laugh, because she understood exactly what that sentence meant. And she understood what would happen when the world heard it. What changes everything? Here's what changes everything actually means. Because the title of this video makes a specific promise, and this is where it gets delivered if these findings were verified. And to be clear, independent verification would be the first and most critical step. The implications would ripple across multiple fields simultaneously. For art history, it would mean The Last Supper was never purely a devotional painting. It was a dual-purpose work, a public commission fulfilling a religious contract and a private act of intellectual rebellion. That reframes not just this painting, but potentially every major Leonardo work. If he hid text here, did he hide it in the Mona Lisa, in the Adoration of the Magi, in the unfinished Saint Jerome? Every Leonardo painting in every museum on Earth would need to be rescanned for religious scholarship. It would mean that one of Christianity's most iconic artistic representations, the image billions of people associate with Jesus' final hours, contained an embedded critique of institutional faith written by the artist himself. That doesn't invalidate the painting's spiritual power, but it fundamentally complicates it. The Last Supper could no longer be viewed as a straightforward act of devotion. It would become a contested document for the history of free thought. It would push the origins of Enlightenment-style reasoning back by more than 2 centuries. Leonardo wouldn't just be a Renaissance genius who painted well. He'd be a covert philosopher who used art as encrypted communication to bypass the most powerful censorship apparatus in Western history. The textbooks would need rewriting. The museum plaques would need updating. The way we teach the Renaissance itself as a flowering of art under church patronage would need to reckon with the possibility that its greatest artist was quietly working against the very institution that paid him. Hands down, that's the most explosive thing a painting has ever been accused of doing. When the findings went public, first through a leaked preprint, then through a wave of global media coverage, the reaction was exactly as chaotic as Rossi had predicted. Professor James Whitfield, a Renaissance historian at Cambridge, appeared on the BBC within 48 hours, calling the discovery the most significant reinterpretation of a major artwork since X-ray analysis revealed Picasso's hidden paintings. He argued that the spiral structure and golden ratio alignment made random deterioration virtually impossible as an explanation. The Vatican's response came 3 days later. A carefully worded statement from the Pontifical Council for Culture acknowledging the remarkable technological achievement while cautioning against premature conclusions that could misrepresent the spiritual legacy of sacred art. Behind the statement, according to Italian press reports, the mood was considerably less diplomatic. In Milan, a crowd of roughly 300 gathered outside Santa Maria delle Gattiere on the first Saturday after the story broke, split between those demanding that the original scans be made public and those carrying signs reading, "Leave the Last Supper in peace and faith is not a data set." A smaller but louder protest erupted at the Uffizi in Florence, where demonstrators blocked the main entrance for 6 hours, forcing the museum to reroute visitors through a side gallery. Italian police eventually cleared the entrance, but the images of officers standing between protesters and a Renaissance museum went viral within hours. Online, the reaction was even more intense. The hashtag Da Vinci Decoded trended globally for 11 consecutive days. Conspiracy theorists claimed the messages proved Leonardo was part of a secret society. Atheist commentators seized on the findings as evidence that history's greatest minds had always doubted organized religion. Religious commentators fired back that a speculative AI reading of degraded plaster was being treated as gospel, which they pointed out was deeply ironic. Ferretti, who had started as the project's loudest skeptic, became its most effective public defender. In an interview with La Repubblica, he said something that cut through the noise. People are afraid because they think this undermines faith. It doesn't. It reveals that Leonardo believed truth and faith were not enemies, but that truth should never be sacrificed to protect authority. That's not an anti-religious idea. That's a profoundly moral one. The team released their full dataset every scan, every AI confidence score, every translation for open peer review. Within weeks, independent analyses from MIT, the University of Amsterdam, and Kyoto University confirmed that the markings were statistically inconsistent with natural plaster degradation. The debate wasn't over, but it had shifted from, is this realness or is it brought to you too? What does it mean? 6 weeks after the initial discovery, Elena Rossi did something she hadn't done in years. She flew to Milan, walked into the refectory of Santa Maria dei Gratiei, and stood in front of the Last Supper. Not a scan, not a digital overlay. The actual painting faded, cracked, patched, and somehow still magnetic after 528 years on that wall. The room was quiet, almost reverent. A small group of tourists stood nearby, whispering and taking photos. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know what she had found. She stared at the dark patch of wall behind Jesus. The exact spot where 3,000 meters away, in a basement lab, an AI had pulled handwriting out of paint that hadn't seen daylight since the 15th century. From where she stood, she could see nothing. Just shadows, just age. Just a wall that looked like every other aging wall in every other old church in Italy. That was the point. She realized that was the entire point. Leonardo had made it invisible. Not because the message was too dangerous for his time, though it absolutely was, but because he believed with a conviction that bordered on prophecy that someday the world would develop eyes sharp enough to find it. He didn't paint for the Duke of Milan who commissioned the work. He didn't paint for the monks. One more time. The disciples sat frozen at the door. She paused and looked back one more time. The disciples sat frozen at their table. Jesus sat at the center calm, knowing in somewhere beneath the surface, 40 phrases waited in the dark, as they had for 5 centuries, as they might for 5 more. The Last Supper had given up one secret. But standing there, looking at those cracked and faded walls, Rossi couldn't shake the feeling that it was still holding back others, that Leonardo even now wasn't finished speaking. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out the next video on your screen.